And Eilidh, I'm not going to really make it through this extensive CV, but it's impressive. I'm just going to tell you how I came across you. Yeah. So I had read this really great book, and I hope some of you have seen it, by a book called England's Population by Andrew Hine, a relatively new book, I think. And it's just brilliant, and I was so impressed with it, and it made me think about so many things about how, in that case, more demographics, I think, and I'm learning, okay, was relevant to my own studies. And so I wrote off to him in my exuberance and said, "Oh, don't you want to come talk with us?" And we ended up here with Eilidh, who is an affiliated researcher with the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure. And I wrote off to Eilidh and said, "Oh, great, we're going to have this seminar." And I told him all about you, told her all about you guys. And she writes back, she says, "That's fine." And I said, it was like, "How can demographics help your study?" And she writes back, she says, "Well, that's fine, but I don't really do demographics, She says, "I do demography." And I thought, I don't really know how to tell Eilidh that I haven't got a clue what she's talking about. But I know, Eilidh, that you are going to tell us about that today, but I think you'll find this interesting, and hopefully in light of Helen and Sherry's conversations, you'll see how this fits into the big picture. So with that, can we please welcome Eilidh Garrett.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Well, I should start off by saying hello. My name's Eilidh, and I'm a demographer. I apologise. I think this morning's talks really set me up very well, because the discussion of language is very apposite. I'm hearing a lot of things that I'm very familiar with, and then I realise I don't understand them. You're using words slightly differently from the way I do. So it's obviously going to be a two-way thing. So please ask if I'm not making myself clear. I have to admit, to starting life, well, my working life, I finished my degree in geography, and then I decided I wanted to be a genealogist. And I went off to the Institute of Heraldry and Genealogy in Kent, and I stuck it for a year, went to St Catherine's House, opened the books, copied it down, did the full works, and then I decided what I really wanted to do was not to do family trees, but to do whole communities. And I hope today I'll explain why people who are interested in one-name studies can also be interested in these community-wide studies, but you let other people do them, come and pick our brains, and maybe we can come and pick your brains about the history of names, geography and migration patterns. It's one of the things demographers have not been very good about, is migration patterns, and you guys seem to know a lot more about it than we do. Now, I'm affiliated to the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, otherwise known as CAMPOP, who are, I think, rightly famous for family reconstitution. I don't do family reconstitution in its pure form, because I'm the Scottish woman who does 19th century history. So a very much lower class citizen in the eyes of most of the Cambridge Group, who are pre-1837 parish register people. It's a good idea, I think, to start with some definitions. As Kim explained, there was a little bit of confusion at the beginning. So I needed to know what a one-name study person did. I hope I'm right. You call yourselves one-namers, is that right? Okay. Goons. Okay, yes, I'd heard about goons. I came and talked to the goons many, many years ago. I wasn't sure if you still used that acronym. So one-name studies is a project researching all occurrences of a surname. And some one-namers restricted to one country. Others, as we heard today, learn languages and study them across the world, which I think is absolutely phenomenal, brilliant. You will recognise this definition. I took it off your website. So, thank you very much. Never put it up there. So all persons with a given surname and its linked variants. Fantastic. Very close to genealogy. So then I thought, okay, well, I know a bit about genealogists. I was one at one point. So genealogy, the branch of knowledge, sounds very grand, doesn't it? Devoted to establishing and authenticating descent lines and related matters. And then there's, in the Dictionary of Demography, which I refer to quite a lot, there is a sub-paragraph that says the techniques and problems involved in genealogy are similar to those used in demography, yay! Where nominal record linkage is used, as in the case of family reconstitution. So I suspect our language problem is not too bad when we're talking. Sorry, I forgot. You can't see that. That was what I was reading. Not very good with this one. So we then move on to demography. Now, people quite often, it used to say if you walked into a tea party and said that you were a statistician, you very quickly found yourself on your own. I've discovered demography has the same effect. Oh, demography, that's big numbers, that's equations. Yes, but it's great fun too. So demography is also a branch of knowledge, we learn, from the Oxford English Dictionary no less, that deals with human populations, especially the statistical analysis of births, deaths, migration, disease. Sound familiar? And demography is the study of human populations in relation to the changes brought about in those populations by the interplay of births, deaths, and migration. So demography is very like one-name studies, except that we do whole communities rather than one-names. And just for Kim's benefit, I have not done it again, demographics are the statistics that the demographers produce. So I could have come and given you a talk about demographics, but I hope you don't mind if I do some demography as well. So demographers are interested, as I said, in a very similar way to the way that you seem to be working, but using it to study populations or communities. So populations tend to mean national populations or even continent populations. Some of us study the demography of Africa. But other people are much more interested in communities. So I am a historical demographer of the Isle of Skye, or Ipswich, or Keighley in West Yorkshire. Those are the communities that I am particularly interested in. So what exactly can demographers offer one-namers? Well, we've already heard today the word context. And I think if we are studying communities in which your families work, then we can offer you context. What demographers really like doing, we're a bit geeky this way, is comparisons. We like comparing one community against another community, one continent against another continent, one time period across another time period. So again, we offer ways of comparing your family with somebody else's family, with the community in which they are operating at any particular time. And the other thing that really sets everybody else's teeth on edge, but is what we do, and Andy Hind is particularly good at this and loves numbers, is calculations. So how do you do the calculations that allow you to compare and put your family in context? Now, nobody wants to discuss mathematics just after lunch. So today I'm not going to discuss mathematics. I'm not going to do much calculation. But I have put on your seats, I hope most of you had access to it, a little A5 sheet with some readings. And if you really wish to pursue some calculations, the books on there, the articles in the journal will help you guide through and give you a starting point of how demographers, and therefore you, can set about doing some of the calculations that might be relevant to your study. Several of the readings that are on that reading list, there are copies of local population studies on the desk to your right, and some volumes on community studies in the Victorian era. Please feel free to help yourself, take it away. I don't want to take it back to St Pancras with me, thank you. But if you could leave a contribution to the funds of the Society, that would be brilliant. Andrew Hind's book, like Kim said, I read it too. I enjoyed it so much I bought 2 copies by accident. So that copy there is up for grabs. So don't all rush at once. I think Kim might have her thumbprint on it though, so ask her first.
I've got mine.
You've got yours. Okay. Anybody else? Please. Okay, let's look at these three: context, comparisons, and a little bit of calculation. I'm quite proud of this. This is my son's. When I was off school feeling ill, what did Mum make me do? Oh yeah, my family tree. So this is my son, Rory, also got a Gaelic name, in the middle here, and he has conducted, he has used this chart, which comes from Phoenix Cards, to put all his ancestors onto this peacock tail of a tree. And as a context, as a genealogist or a one-namer, I know my family quite well, I think, but just how typical is it? I would want to know, do my particular family members marry young? Do they die young? Do they die from, sorry, I'm very morbid, I like death. What do they die of, and do lots of other people die from it? I've just spent almost 2 years coding causes of death, so I'm happy with death. And in 1897, my great-grandmother died of a burst appendix. How many of yours died of a burst appendix? And she died of a burst appendix because she had recently given birth to my grandmother. So A, I was intrigued whether burst appendices very often are connected to childbirth, and B, how many other people died of burst appendices in that era. So I went off and I did some research about it. It's all right, we're not going to discuss any more burst appendices. But another question that I might have of this family tree is they moved around a lot. Now, some of these branches took different, quite interesting journeys. Some ended up in India. Was that typical of their time, of their era? How many people went to India, etc., etc.? So, how many came back again? The idea that you can take family trees and then ask bigger, broader research questions is something that hopefully you will take away from you today. What does your family tree say that you could go and ask other people who've done some research? This is a theme that the previous speakers have talked about before. One of the things that intrigued me was that certain branches of this family we know right back to 1855, which is where the Scottish records, because it's all Scottish. My son is 62/64 Scottish, and the other 2/64 are Irish. But some of the branches are filled in and some aren't. And the reason is because my father's family all married rather late, so they could only fit in a few generations, whereas my husband's family all married really young, so we've got lots and lots of generations on this family tree. And that's something that excites demographers. Don't know if it excites one-namers, but it excites demographers. So how can we take our family stories and put them into context? Well, demographers use lots of different types of context. As I said, they tend to study communities. It depends which era you're studying, what kind of communities you can consider. Now, the Cambridge Group are famous, hopefully, for their reconstitutions. They link families together from particular communities, and these are the 26 communities that they have reconstructed or reconstituted. They used to keep them very close to their chests. They didn't like to let them go, but if you now go on the Cambridge Group website, you can dig around and find out a lot more about these 26 communities and the data they used. So if any of these communities are of interest in your family histories, go for it. The Cambridge Group would love to have you looking at their data. The other thing that they have done, which was rather earlier, is they're known as the 404 parishes. And there they didn't reconstitute, they didn't link the families together. What they did was just count up the numbers of births, marriages and deaths. And you can acquire the data, again, off the website. They will tell you where to get it. So there are 404, which are the blue blobs, are the parishes for which they have done this counting up of births, marriages and deaths. The aggregate analysis is called. You can find this at www.jog.can.ac.uk/research projects. I believe I put it on the reading list if anybody wants to follow that up. They are now augmenting the 404 with another 200 and something, which are the red parishes. So they're gradually spreading out to cover bigger and numbers of areas. But these are all pre-1837. Some of them will go back to 1500s. We can then, this is my era. I know about the 19th century. I'm not too sure about pre-1837. I'm very sorry, because I understand some of you go back to 1200, which makes me feel very inadequate. I'm really sorry. But demographers, as I said earlier, choose different areas, different communities to compare and contrast. And this series of 3 maps gives context to your study, but also helps you compare your ancestors' behaviour. I'm very interested in fertility decline. Why did we stop having families of 7, 8, 9 children and start worrying about the fact we're only having less than 2? And this map, these series of maps, which were drawn by Robert Woods when he was at Sheffield, he then moved to Liverpool, demonstrates the situation of fertility in 1861, and then in 1891, and then over to the blue map in 1911. So we can see that in 1861, there was a north-west, southeast contrast, but everybody was having high fertility at the red and yellow end of the scale. And then we can begin to see that as the century progressed, there was an increasing contrast. And we were very interested to spot this blue, which is the lowest category, actually started in the cotton towns of Lancashire. And then by 1911, most of the rest of the country is towards blue and purple. The people up here, on average, were having about 7 children, and the people in 1911 were having about 5.5 children. Family size was reducing, and that process kept going into the 1930s, and then it began to climb up again, and then it went down again. But that's a different story completely. So where your family came from in these maps, and at which time you're looking at them, will let you put whether they were behaving like the rest of the population in that area in context. Calculating these figures, the scale, the number at the top, is an index. It means very little to anybody who hasn't spent at least 3 weeks following how to calculate these measures. But it basically says if a lady got married age 20 in 1861 and then had children at the rate that all the other women in different age groups were having in 1861, she would end up with 7 children. And the same in 1911. If you behaved like the women in 1911, you would end up with 5.5 children. Is everybody still awake? Now, demographers, and I'm supposed to be standing in front of the camera, and I'm not doing a very good job. Demographers tend to do their comparisons depending on their sources and what level of geographic breakdown they can actually gain the statistics that they need, or the population numbers that they need. So the previous map was based on registration districts, but you might like to look at sub-registration districts if the statistics are available in the Registrar General's reports or the census reports, or if you're really lucky, you can look at the parish. Now, you can look at an individual parish. That's probably what one person can cope with, I must admit. But now more and more sources for the whole country are being put online so that you can compare and contrast every parish. Draw your map using every parish in the land. There are over 10,000 of them. And the Cambridge Group has been doing this. These are very recent. They are up on the website, so if you'd like to go and poke around and have a look, please feel free. But this map, the map on your left, yes, your left, shows population density in England and Wales in 1801. And then over the course of the century, so by 1891, this map here shows how population density has increased rapidly. So did your ancestor live in a very undense place in 1801? And how crowded were they, must have they been living when you see them in 1891? For those of you who are really into computer science and GIS and whatever, these maps have actually been massaged, so the geography of the parishes has been kept constant, so there's no boundary changes involved. Well, there are, but you can't see them on this map. So that's one kind of thing that demographers do. The other kind of thing that demographers do are calculations that can take a number of dimensions. I feel a bit like Doctor Who sometimes saying, yes, we work in 3 dimensions. And our dimensions are time, age, and then cohort, which is time and age. Now, demographers tend to prefer, at least in Britain, where our sources are very time or age-specific based, to the plain up and down and side to side. And unless you're a family reconstitutor, or a one-name study, or a genealogist person, we tend not to indulge in cohort and longitudinal analysis. And this is a point that we as demographers feel non-demographers really need to get a hold of, is when you look at a source, is it giving you a time perspective, an age group perspective, or a cohorts perspective? Because the story that these 3 dimensions tell is quite different. And if you read it, it's this language thing again, if you read it as this is what's happening in 1892, it's a time. If this is what's happening to somebody who's 64 in 1982, then that's a cohort kind of measurement. Does that make sense? I'm not sure it made sense to me, but yes. Anyway. So if you can keep these 3 little grids in your head as we go through, I'll give you some examples of the different time, age group, and cohort measures. Many of you will be very familiar with statistics from the Registrar General's reports or the census reports. It was mentioned this morning that we have www.hispop.org, and if you haven't encountered this website, I strongly advise you to go and spend at least 3 weeks immersing in it. It's wonderful. Okay, if you like statistics. But you can get very fine geography statistics. So down here, just at the bottom, is Bexhill in the registration district of Battle, which I believe, somebody will no doubt correct me, that Burgess Hill actually sits in. No? Thank you. Where does it sit? Is it
now in Rotherham and Hastings. Okay.
I think in 1882, I'm not sure, but I think it was in Battle Registration District. I will stand corrected, but thank you. And here we get told the population in 1891 and the number of births and the number of deaths that are going on that happened in 1882 in Bexhill for Battle. So we can then calculate that about, for every 1,000 people in this Bexhill, there were 31 births that year and 14 deaths, which is a big gap if you're going to have population increase. So this area was probably seeing quite substantial population growth. And it seemed a very healthy place if there's only 14 people per 1,000 dying. Manchester, you're looking more at quite a lot, 60, 70. So very nice place to live if you're looking at health. But this is all for a year, and therefore is a period perspective on what was happening in Bexhill at that time. This is also about mortality. I have a lot of interest in Scotland, as you can probably tell from the accent. And as I said, I was coding lots of causes of death. So this is mortality rates by cause for an age group over time. So from 1855 right up to 1955. And you can see that perinatal mortality causes, so deaths in the first month, were carrying off many infants in Scotland, but so too were respiratory diseases but they were in decline, and infectious diseases, which at the beginning of the period were carrying off a substantial proportion, have almost virtually disappeared by the end of by the middle of the 20th century. So that's one age group followed over time. So it's that long, thin perspective that we were looking at in the second diagram. And just to make the point, here is mortality rate for men aged 25 to 34, again in Scotland. Tuberculosis, this colour here, huge killer of this age group, and then it's beginning to peter out by the middle of the century, but not disappeared yet. This is not the First World War, because these are only civilian men. That's the flu epidemic that hit in 1918-19. And you can see that it's not just the respiratory diseases, the others are all carried up on the back of that respiratory disease. So, and despite the fact that it's a civilian population, the World War II shows up quite dramatically amongst this age group in Scotland, not when they went to the front. So that whether or not that's because men who were ill didn't go to the front, and therefore the demographic rates went up because there were lots of sick people left at home, we need some more research. But again, an age group, over time, that long, thin perspective. Linking records, as it says at the bottom here, gives a longitudinal perspective. And this is why many British demographers don't do this kind of work, because it's very hard work, as you all know. But a few do have carried out, the big teams of them, usually the Cambridge group is one such team, link together the births, the marriages, the deaths. That's if you're a purist family reconstitutor, and then if you're an interloper like me, you add in the censuses. True reconstitution doesn't involve censuses because you have to, it kind of mucks up in some ways the demographic analyses that you can do, but it has such a rich backdrop of economic and social and family history that I find that it is an enormously rewarding extra exercise to take your births, marriages and deaths and then link them to the census material. So this gives you, by doing this linkage, will give you a lovely cohort and or longitudinal perspective on your research questions, as long as you do lots of people. There's no point, I'm sorry, doing just one person and doing some analysis of these kind of issues, because you don't know whether your family is normal, totally abnormal, or completely loopy. I'm afraid mine's completely loopy, and they lie through their teeth because the records, when you add them together, they're absolutely no resemblance to the history that they tell you. So I'm one of these record linking slightly mad people, and I've been working on the Isle of Skye and comparing the very rural Skye, where they're collecting seaweed, digging with hand tools, and living in these little crofts with their strip of land on the seashore at exactly the same time as the people in our second community, Kilmarnock, are enjoying trams, lots of shops, and municipal buildings that are still standing and looking, very imposing even today. So we were interested in comparing the demography of Skye with the demography of Kilmarnock. Now, what could I show you? How much could I tell you about the demography of Skye in the time allotted? And basically, this is what demographers do with the kind of information that you guys are collecting. I was very lucky to find this picture of the MacPhail family. This is Mary MacPhail and her husband Angus. Mary. Angus, looking very biblical, I think, with his white bushy beard. And their 7 children. Now, they're unusual in many respects for their era, because all the children survived to adulthood. That's them standing there, looking very neat and trim, and I think trying to emulate the king or somebody at the time with their bushy beards and their great big handlebar moustaches. Well, what we as demographers are interested in is the fact that Mary got married when she was 29 and a half in 1854, and then the dates of the children allow us to calculate her age when she was having them, and the dates, the span of years in between each birth. So she started off, she had 15 months between her first birth, and then 1.6, just over a year and a half for the next, and so on. And they begin to get spaced out a bit, as she probably has more children to deal with. She and Angus may not get together quite so often. But she finished, she was 43.2 years old when she had her final child, 6.8 years before she reached her 50th birthday, when demographers decide that women are not going to have any more children. So we now have a complete, for us, this is a superb family history because it tells you all these details about her behaviour. Now there are some demographers who will then go off and work out whether or not she breastfed her children from the gaps between them. And if you go and read the family reconstitution books, Wrigley and Schofield, for example, they expect, on average, gaps between children to be 2 years. Now, Mary was doing a lot better than that, which suggests, and again, there are researchers who will use these birth spacings to say how well fed she is, how healthy she is, and therefore is producing children. There's absolutely, I think you'd have to really work hard to squeeze in a miscarriage or a stillbirth into this lot. She was a very healthy lady, we think. She looks kind of robust. And by looking at the children, I believe the picture was taken in the late 1880s. So the children are, late 1890s, sorry. So the children are well grown up. But guessing at that, then she must be probably 70 in this picture, I would think. But they're all sitting there and looking very hale and hearty. But it's a beautiful illustration that you know all the names, but it's the gaps between them, it's the maths, it's the calculations that you can do with just this one family. But we still don't know whether Mary was typical. If she'd married at 20, how many children would she have had instead of 29? And was she unusual on Skye that she was marrying at this age? Did she have an unusual number of children, an unusual number surviving? The bottom line is she's not unusual. She's marrying a bit late, but women in Skye on average married about 26, 27, so she's a bit late. Lots of them had this number of children. She is slightly atypical that she didn't lose one. So we've now said she's pretty typical, at least in the Skye context. Compared with Kilmarnock, she is weird. They marry very young, and they don't have so many children, and they lose an awful lot more than is true of the Skye population, as you might expect in an urban area versus a very rural one. Well, we've done a little bit of fertility, we've done a little bit of mortality, and now we'll come to what I'm beginning to understand one namers really like, which is migration. And thank you, because it is brilliant to talk to people who like migration, because demographers don't talk migration, they talk everything else, but they don't like people who move, because they spoil their statistics. And my interest is that exactly that. Everybody's moving. That the history we had earlier, where she was all over the shop. She would be horrendous as a subject of a demographic history, but she's very, I suspect, really quite typical. Maybe not travelling across the Atlantic, but people in history moved. They didn't stay put, or did they? We don't know. Demographers do not know how many people stayed in a place. They know who had stayed in a place and died, or stayed in a place and had births, but they don't know who stayed in a place and did nothing, or moved out, because they've stopped doing the things that the sources tell us that means that they're still there. And my interest is how much does that muck up my demographic statistics, because so many of the population have left. What they did here, and this time I've used the population of St Andrews and Fife, because I'm going to talk to some St Andrews students next week, so I hope you don't mind having a preview of their slide. But I was interested in getting them to think about how many people born in St Andrews are still in St Andrews 50 years later. Okay, many of them will have died, but many of them will have migrated away. Now, right down in the corner here is a very small website called isem.data-archive.ac.uk. This website has only recently come alive, and it is a database of every individual enumerated in England, Wales, or Scotland in 1851, 1861, 1871, not 1871 for England and Wales, 1881, 1891, 1901, and for England and Wales, 1911. So that's every single person with all their census data is now online to be analysed, except their names. Sorry, guys. I knew that wouldn't go down well. The names have been collected, but they're not being released to the public because of the demand, and the website can't cope. So they have restricted this to analysing or collecting, gaining access to the data yourself. So if you want to know everybody who was born in Bexhill, you can go to the ISEM website and ask how many Bexhill-born people, or people who said that they were born in Bexhill in the 1861 census, and it will throw them out to you. And it will tell you where they were enumerated. So you can see a beautiful pattern of where all the Bexhill-born people are. So what I did here was I went and I asked them to show me the 10-year-olds in 1851, the 20-year-olds in 1861, the 30-year-olds in 1871, etc., up to the 50 to 60-year-olds in 1901, who gave the birthplace of St Andrews in the census, and then asked where they were, which counties in Scotland were they actually sitting in. And this told me that if we take all the 0 to 10-year-olds in 1851 as 100%, by the time we get to 1901, there were fewer than 50% of them still sitting in St Andrews. They had all moved away. Many of them had moved away. And most of this cohort moved away quite a lot had moved by the time they were in their teens, but most of them who were going to move had moved by the time they were in their 20s. And then the question is, where did they go? And because the census, this ISEM website can tell you, you can see that people in St Andrews, when they moved out, each of the blocks is a county of Scotland. I tried to put it on a map, but it didn't work, as she said, please send it by now, please send it. And I'm trying to get my map to work, and it wouldn't work. So in the end, I'm sorry you've got a graph, which may not be quite as beautifully coloured, but it gets over the message. I couldn't put all the St Andrews people who were still in St Andrews, because they would have been up here. So I've got everybody who has moved somewhere else in Fife, the county in which St Andrews sits. It's that little sort of Cairn Terrier head on the right of Scotland. If you're not totally familiar with the geography of Scotland, I do forget I live in England now, and not everybody knows where all these places are. So you can see that the majority of people who've moved out of St Andrews have actually moved, both, this is males, this is females, have moved out of St Andrews into the rest of Fife. Some have moved to Edinburgh, as you might expect, and they have tended to move as they hit their 20s. So you can imagine, okay, Angus, it's time you went and earned your living off to the city with you, but you're not going before you're 21 and know what you're doing. So they get to leave when in their 20s. Not the sort of typical, we have this theory that everybody left at 13 and went to be a maid in somebody else's house. This doesn't seem to be quite the story these figures are telling. Some moved to Glasgow, that's Lanarkshire, and some moved to Forfar, which is the Duke Jam and journalism in Dundee, mostly. So these maps, it enables you to pull out where your population have moved to. And just to finish off, a completely different kind of profile of the people of Skye. They don't move to Edinburgh, they move to Glasgow, and they tend to move to Argyll and Ross and Cromarty, the two counties next to Skye that they can get to by boat. And the interesting one that I really want to research are these people in Haddington, very near Edinburgh, which seems to be where the laird sent his unmarried mothers to have their illegitimate children, and that's why only women are there and not men. But a completely different migration profile for this community compared to the St Andrews community. So a cohort view on migration that allows us to compare, contrast, put our populations in context, and then as a demographer I can do some calculations and give you the results so you don't have to do them, but hopefully enjoy the statistics and what it tells you about your particular family. So, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I've really learned a lot already. I'm looking forward to the rest of the day, and thank you so much for listening to Demography.
On that cohort study, how did you handle the deceased? Were they among the missing, or did you eliminate them from the birth, or how did that happen?
For this, I didn't. I left that. These are just the migrants. These are the survivors. So that drop in 50% includes people who've died, and it also includes anybody who's moved away from Scotland. It's only those figures are only those who are still in Scotland. You could go to the Registrar General's reports and work out how many deaths are happening, but they don't always give you the age groups of who's dying, and it also depends which community you're studying, whether or not you can get the statistics that really match your registration district or your parish. So it is slightly source dependent, and the reason that I haven't put the deaths in yet is because this side was only doing very recently and I haven't had a chance to work out where the deaths go. But you're quite right, there should be deaths in there, lost by death, but it's not, it wasn't quite what I was trying to show on the thing, on the slides.
When I see statistics like this, it just raises so many questions.
Oh, good.
I guess my interest is in social history as well as family history, and knowing the accuracy of the data you're using. I guess if I could summarise my key questions I would approach you. You opened up using we talked about the Cambridge group using parish registers. Have they done any work removing the background radiation that's variable across the UK for non-conformists? Because that's going to potentially skew, either you choose a parish where you're certain there's no non-conformity, because the records, or you somehow done a lot of work looking through the non-conformist records that may not necessarily relate to parish. The second question then relates to the civil registration records. Now, we all know that certainly up to about 1860s to 1870, they are direction correct, but absolutely not correct. So it's interesting to know how you've managed to remove all the background noise that could be significant, and certainly in some of the industrial areas from that. And then the graphs are fantastic, and I would love to see education and occupation overlaid in there, because that would give me, that becomes really, really quite exciting, because if you see those two things, is it driven by these dynamics working through, which have been evolving through changing education during that, maybe even 100 years in those communities, coming through in here, and therefore they are moving for economic reasons, or is it just a scattergun of random, they're just ending up in these places? Anyway, that's enough.
And Andy, I'm going to have to ask. He gets the short answer. He gets the short answer, and then it's a break.
Yep. Okay, short answer is the Cambridge Group reconstitutions are 26 parishes where they thoroughly checked the registers for their comprehensiveness and their completeness. There's lots of demographic tweaks and tricks that you can do to check that they are as complete as can be. They chose the parishes specifically because they knew there were not non-conformist chapels nearby. So those are as clean as you can get. It took them years, and if you read the book's about that thick and about that much as how our parishes are really good. But when you read it, they started out with many, many more parishes. They actually started with 404, that's where that came from, and realised that only 26 of those 404 were actually good for reconstitution. And they give you a set of rules how to make sure that it's really good. Everything else you've said is totally compatible, totally true, and demographers spend ages and ages, and it would take you probably a 4-year degree course, but you're very welcome to come and we'll teach you how to do it. And this stuff is totally new, and therefore I should give it a health warning. This is Butte, and suddenly on Butte there are 200 people from Skye. No, they're not. They just miscoded the birthplace from Skye. So what I want the students to do next week is to go and make sure how much of this data is clean and how much they've actually got their coding system wrong. That was the point of the slide that it was going to be used as. But it does, in the big picture with the broad brush, it shows migration. But there's quite a lot of work to do to clean that up and tell the proper story. And that you're dead right. You have to keep checking your statistics and questioning your sources. Do not take your sources for granted, and do not assume they're clean. Yeah, I think we're going to have a lovely coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Sorry to overrun.